Welcome to another episode of the Dentology podcast, where we discuss the business of dentistry. In this podcast series, we'll be discussing all the non-clinical aspects of dentistry, from goodwill values, finance, marketing, how to buy and sell a dental practice, mindset, through to where you can invest your money in team management issues. My name is Andy Acton, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Strevens. Let's jump straight into it.
Sometimes we have guests on and you're not sure which way it's going to go, do you? You think, is this person going to talk? Are we going to get the content we want? Would it make a good episode? We didn't have that concern with this guest, did we?
We had no doubt about Chris, I tell you.
Yeah.
I just thought it was fascinating. One, those years, I didn't realise he was the age he is. And two, how long he's been in dentistry. I know that we've been in dentistry for, feels like ages. He's been in dentistry for ages. It's just brilliant the way it went, I think.
That's right, yeah. And also just his resilience of how he goes about things.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot about the extreme stuff he's done, mountains, deserts, that TV program he did many years ago now. But a lot of that really does feed through into, I'm sure, how he works with his clients in bringing them through difficult times.
Yeah, I think for me, it's sort of one of those... He's either a bit of an adrenaline junkie or he just likes challenging himself or whatever. But then there's this huge, massive irony in the fact he slides off his bike at 15 miles an hour and breaks 7 ribs, collarbone in 4 places, could have cracked his skull open, but and cheese grated himself in a relatively innocuous when he's done all this other stuff. But it's just like, in a way, it's almost a lesson, isn't it? The fact you can do all this stuff and then the smallest thing can trip you up.
Oh, yeah. And also how he shared what looks like success for him. I think people will be very interested to hear his definition, which is a lot around contentment. It was really good, really enjoyable.
He was a great guy.
So here we are yet again, and today this person needs zero introduction.
Who is he?
He is an incredibly well-known personality within the dental profession. And we are delighted to have Chris Barrow join us today.
We are indeed. Look at that.
Welcome, Mr. Barrow. How are you?
I am very well, and very good morning to both of you, and thank you so much for the introduction. As you know, I spend quite a lot of my time interviewing other people, and so it's really nice to be on the other side of it for a change. Thanks for the intro.
Exactly. You can just sit there and talk and share your stories. No preparation on your side at all.
I'm just intrigued. Was it a can of beer, Chris?
There we go.
Look, for all of you who thought, Chris at this time of the morning, because we are doing them always having a beer, he's not.
Although I could very carefully have siphoned some home brew in there.
Oh yeah.
You could. Well, I found out on that very point. I went to the football match on Monday, England playing Germany, and I did see at half time somebody went and got themselves a coffee cup and distilled into their coffee cup their pint of beer, put a lid on it, because you're allowed to take hot drinks pitch side, but you can't take beer. And they poured a pint of beer into a coffee cup.
How desperate do you have to be that you can't have a drink for 45 minutes?
I was going to say, part of me said how ingenious, and the other part said, really?
Sado.
But there we go.
I was going to suggest, how desperate do you need to be to go to Wembley on a weekday night to watch an England-Germany game? But there you go. That's another conversation altogether.
Yeah.
For how they're playing at the moment, I tend to agree with you.
But at least a game of football broke out.
It did in the second half.
It did in the second half, and I've got no room to talk whatsoever, given the team that I support up in Manchester as well.
I was going to say, we'll both keep quiet on that. We share the same team, and Chris supports Arsenal, so we will not be having conversations about football.
At the moment, we're doing all right. Yeah. I just preface that at the moment.
Yeah. The great thing is we can edit this if we need to, so if it goes off down a detour, we'll just scrub any references to Arsenal.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Or anyone.
Anyway, we should get on. We should get on. So, Chris, thank you very much indeed for your time for joining us. We should start with checking on your well-being, because you had a pretty bad cycling accident fairly recently, which I know you shared with people on social media. But how are you doing? It's a few weeks on now, but how's your recovery going?
Yeah, it is interesting. It's such as social media, of course, that everybody knows. But I'm doing great, thank you. And way back when, on the 6th of August, first day back, actually, after a 2-week holiday in Greece. And we were out walking the dogs in the morning, and I said to my wife, not quite sure what to do this afternoon. I could have a 2-hour siesta like we've been doing on holiday, or I could just get my bike out and go and have a ride for a couple of hours. And I said, do you know what? I think I'll get some fresh air. So isn't it funny how your life can pivot on a very, very simple decision like that? Because little did I realise that no more than 25 minutes and 5 miles later, I'd be minding my own business, riding down a very quiet tarmac country lane at not a very great speed, I have to admit. And 1 second and 1 dinner plate size gravel patch later, the bike goes left, I go right, and wake up what was probably no more than about 60 seconds later, staring at the sky with 4 heads looking down at me going, are you all right? And cut to the chase, 7 broken ribs, collarbone broken in 4 places, most of the right hand side of my body cheese grated down the road, 6 days in hospital, 1 titanium plate where my collarbone used to be, and the best part of about 6 or 7 weeks off work. So should have had a siesta.
You should have.
But as we were saying there, Chris, if there's a advocate of making sure you wear a helmet. Wear a helmet. Listen, those cyclists, unbelievable.
If they ever need a new ambassador for the wear a crash helmet every time you ride a bike campaign, it's got to be me. And I've kept my crash helmet as a memento, because even though I wasn't travelling particularly quickly, even though there was nobody else involved, my crash helmet was totaled. And frankly, if I hadn't been wearing that, I probably wouldn't be able to speak to you the way I am doing now. So, you've got to count your blessings. Wow. And I am also going to take. I am going to take the opportunity of saying something that I do feel very strongly about, which is that being in the hands of the National Health Service during that period of time, I've been very, very fortunate to be a very well person for the majority, if not the whole of my life, and I've had 1 or 2, knocks and bruises and scrapes, but there's never been anything to write home about, and. I cannot praise highly enough the first response team, the ambulance team, the A&E team at Wythenshawe Hospital, and the people that looked after me in the thoracic unit for 6 days, and also the surgical team that have put my collarbone back together again. The whole experience has just been something that I think we can be very proud of. And, we might get around in the context of this conversation to talking about the National Health Service insofar as it applies to dentistry. We shall see. But certainly the National Health Service insofar as it applies to looking after me in the last few months has been something that I've been hugely grateful for. And
it's nice to hear. I think A&E on the NHS side, I think the A&E really is incredible. When you need them, they're there.
I was in Wythenshawe Hospital, South Manchester, on a Saturday. I arrived at about 2:00 Saturday afternoon. I was in A&E till 4:00 Sunday morning, 14 hours in total. And I've got to tell you, Saturday night, Wythenshawe Hospital, A&E, it was a bit like the Star Wars cabin. Again, I've got nothing but admiration for the team that work there. And you know what? If David Attenborough runs out of things to do television series about, Blue Planet this and Blue Planet that, he just needs to go down there and sit and watch the variety of ways in which Homo sapien evolves over the years. It's been quite remarkable.
It's a bit like those Darwin Awards, isn't it? How stupid can you be to injure yourself?
A 14-hour cultural revelation.
Yeah.
Oh my word.
Chris, how did you find you're so full of energy and you're relentless in what you do? So how did you find this enforced period of rest? Did you embrace it? Did it frustrate you?
It was okay. I mean, I am frustrated by the lack of physical activity because, I'm somebody who does a lot of physical stuff. Whether I'm running marathons, although I am now I've enforced my own retirement from marathons because of injuries. But since I gave up running marathons, it's been all about the bicycle. And when it's not about the bicycle, it's about doing all sorts of other crazy stuff. And I was mentioning to Chris before we came on the call that it's ironic that in June this year, I was able to climb the highest mountain in Italy, Gran Paradiso, 4,000 meters. Because I'm still very, very blessed to be able to do that kind of crazy stuff at my age. And so I'm frustrated by the fact that temporarily I'm unable to exercise as much as I can. But during my period of enforced isolation, I'm a very avid reader and always have been. And all I decided to do was to upscale the number of books I was reading. So I always set myself a target every single year. I set myself a target of reading at least 30 good novels. And I have to say that I'm here we are in the back end of September, and I'm currently reading novel number 29 of the year, and I'm going to pass my own target.
Okay.
So I'm lying in a bed, feeling a bit sorry for myself, and all right, I've got to admit that I did spend a little bit of time on an iPad, keeping my eye on what was going on work-wise, keeping my eye on what was going on insofar as the industry is concerned. But primarily, it's about lying in bed and saying, okay, well, what am I going to use my time to do constructively? And for me, reading is a passion. For some other people, listening to music is a passion. Now, I'm not a particular music buff. My wife is the music buff in the family, and she's a Wikipedia on music knowledge. Whereas when she says we're going to a live concert, I kind of go, meh. Because music isn't my thing. But we've got so many books in the house. I've actually hired a storage unit to put the books that we can't fit in the house anymore into. So that's what I did.
Did you use a book or a Kindle?
I don't use Kindles, and the reason for that is because I spend so much time online. That the last thing I want to do at the end of the day is to pick up an electronic device. So actually, I go down to Waterstones and I browse and I buy predominantly hardback books. And I love that tactile experience of picking up a book and reading it and, dare I say, smelling the book, feeling the book.
I'll go with you. Yeah.
When you've sat down here doing 26 Zoom calls and 3 webinars in a week, you've had enough of electronics. And so
I was just thinking, a man with 7 broken ribs and a broken shoulder, trying to turn the pages or hold a heavy book. That's all I was thinking. I was thinking that must have been quite a practical challenge, almost, in a way.
But also, I think from sorry, go on, Chris.
I was going to say, pathetically enough, if you could have seen me back then, I was either lying in bed or lying on the sofa with a huge U-shaped cushion behind me and a pillow sat on my knee with the book resting on my knee, turning the pages over with my good hand.
Okay, right. With your good hand.
You were well set up. But also, I think there is a difference. I think when you have a paper book, I find that the information sticks better. If occasionally I listen to audio books, and I've got a Kindle as well, but I don't think that information sticks in the same way as actually having a book. Because also you can turn the page down, or you can write a little note in the side, particularly if it's a business related or information led book. I think the information sticks differently, and I don't know if there's any stats or evidence on this, but if I listen to an audio book, it's almost just like white noise in the background. It's enjoyable in that moment, but I don't retain the information in anything like the same way.
Interesting.
Well, the psychologists don't they, that people have got different learning. Some are auditory, some are visual, some are kinetic, and I think there's a lot of that involved in this as well. There are some people that will go and sit and read graphic novels because they are really, really stimulated by the visual experience of reading a graphic novel. Other people, Colin Campbell, for example, I know is an avid audiobook listener. He walks the dog, listens to podcasts, walks the dog, listens to books. I don't do Audible. I don't listen to books audibly because I want that tactile experience. I'm all about the kinetics.
Yeah. Yeah, we've obviously known as a group, we've known one another for many years. I think we were reminiscing before we started recording. It's probably 20 years. It could be 20 years plus.
Yeah, definitely.
You've been in dentistry a long while, and you're well known in dentistry. But what were you like as a kid? What was your life like before dentistry? Because I'm sure there's people that only ever know you because you're so well known within dentistry. But there was a Chris before dentistry, wasn't there?
Well, yes, there was, and can I say that I am rather dubiously proud of the fact that this year I'm celebrating my 52nd year of full-time employment. This month, in actual fact, it's 52 years this month since I first got a full-time job, and. And what's interesting about that is that those 52 years are divided exactly down the middle by the last 26 years having been about dentistry full time. But the 26 years before that, rather interestingly, of course, were financial services. And so I, as a 16-year-old school leaver, with 4.5 GCSE O levels, as they were called in those days.
GCSEs, bring them on.
And I joined an insurance company in St. Peter's Square in central Manchester, which in those days was called the Friends Provident and Century Group. Day one, as a 16-year-old school leaver. I joined on the same day as another guy who subsequently became a very good friend, a lad called Steve Hyam. And, we were talking earlier about single moments that can pivot your life. And on that very first day at work, Steve and I turned up on the first day. We'd never met each other before. And the two of us stood there in front of the assistant branch manager, Mr. Peter Radband. And he looked at us and he pointed at Steve Hyam and he said, "You go and sit in the motor insurance department." And then he pointed at me and he said, "You go upstairs and go and sit in the life department." And from that moment on, partly our futures and our careers were defined. Steve Hyam subsequently became a loss adjuster and ended up running his own loss adjusting business in the centre of Manchester. I went upstairs to the life department and spent the next 26 years in financial services as office boy, administrator, office manager, what they used to call back in the day life insurance inspector, which was basically a technical rep for a life insurance company. Subsequently became a broker consultant for one of the early unit-linked life insurance companies, Hambro Life Insurance, and then became an independent financial advisor in 1987. And was, I have to say, rather proud, one of the 6 founder members of the Institute for Financial Planning who introduced fee-based financial planning for the first time into the UK, 1987-ish. And then through to about 1996, where at that point in time, I decided really I'd had enough of financial services. Frankly, I was bored. And I'd developed a client base of small to medium-sized business owners. They were asking me for help in running the businesses. And so I decided between about 93 and 96 to move into business consultancy. And then accidentally tripped over and fell into dentistry and decided that was a place I was going to spend the majority of my time. So in terms of background, half and half.
Chris, how did you accidentally trip into dentistry?
1987, as an independent financial advisor, I used to do all my business by running seminars for company directors on how to put the money into director pension arrangements. So I'd have 100 people in a hotel room and I'd stand at the front of the room with a flip chart and a pen because we didn't have any technology in those days. And I'd used to spend about an hour and a half doing box presentations on the flip chart. You can move your money from company A to company B, and company B is tax-free. You might remember that kind of thing. Signing up pension plans. One of the people who came to one of those early seminars was a fella called Brian Gordon, who ran Crown Dental Laboratory in Chorley in Lancashire. Through word of mouth, between 87 and about 89, I developed a lot of dental lab owners as financial services clients. And in fact, in 1993, one of those lab owners called me and said, I need your help with something. And I said, what is it? And in 1993, he says, I've got a dentist who owes me £30,000 in unpaid lab bills. And I've sent him all sorts of letters saying, I need you to pay your lab bills. And he still hasn't paid me. So I've told him that he's got a choice. I either put the debt collectors in, or I put Chris Barrow in to help him to try and sort his business out to pay my bills. And he's chosen you.
Wow.
So my first meeting with a dentist was that dentist who rather begrudgingly agreed to see me. I very quickly found out that not only did he owe his lab 30 grand, but he owed the Inland Revenue, he owed his school fees, and he owed everybody else in town. In fact, the guy was up to his neck in problems and debt. I spent 2 years helping him to dig himself out of that. Partly, I have to say, by refinancing his house, partly by helping him to run his business profitably for the first time. My lab owner got his 30 grand, so I obviously was top of his fan club. The dentist got himself sorted out, and that was kind of how it got started. And so you could say that my career started as a debt collector for dentists.
What a great way to learn, though, doesn't it? I mean, you were in at the ground floor, weren't you? I mean,
well, and it was a very, very early realization that, first of all, the dentist in question had not got the faintest idea how to run a business, and had never had any training. And secondly, also,
which is still the case today for many of them, isn't it? In terms of the training side of things, isn't it? The brutal reality.
Yeah, and I also, and as an aside, just recall that it was shortly after that I started approaching some of the dental schools to say I'd be more than happy to come along and do some presentations to your dental students on managing their own finances. And to say that I was stonewalled would be an understatement. Broadly speaking, the response was that we're here to teach people dentistry. We're not here to teach them how to make a profit. Mm. And so the dental schools unanimously slammed the door in my face. And I'm big enough and daft enough to take the message. I just walked away from it and thought, okay, well, if the dental schools aren't prepared to teach them, somebody has, and has to do it. And I have to say that I'm very fortunate that although my business has almost exclusively grown through word of mouth, that dentist didn't refer me to all of his friends who were broke. What happened is that the dental technicians I was working with, and also some of the early dentists I was working with, started to recommend me to their friends and peer groups and so on. And that was how it got going. And it was slow, it was organic. It took me about 3 years to kind of transition into dentistry, to the extent that I felt that there was enough in it for me to be able to do it full time.
Wow. That's fascinating.
That's a great story.
That is a brilliant story.
So for lots of people, we've got a broad church in terms of who listens to this. We get some, quite a lot of very young dentists and some people who are still waiting to qualify. You've got this depth of experience of what dentistry looks like and has changed over those 20 plus years. What did it look like? What did those practices look and feel like back then compared to where they are now? What are the significant changes you've seen over those decades?
I described that recently. Somebody asked me a similar question recently, a client actually, and I said to compare and contrast the mid-90s to where we are now in dentistry. I would compare a chimpanzee with a jawbone to an astronaut in a spaceship. That's how big a gap there are between the two. And even from a business perspective, I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about the differences that have taken place in clinical dentistry during that time. But I think we can go through a product list which would include tooth whitening, it would include clear aligners, it would include smile design. To a large extent, and for the majority of the population, it would include implant and restorative dentistry. You can say that none of those existed in the 90s clinical environment. Dental implants was the preserve of the upper class, rich and famous people. The ordinary working person would never have dreamed of having access to that. It was still drill, fill and bill when I first came into the industry, even though I arrived 4 years after Denplan started and around about the same year that Practice Plan started. It was the business was still predominantly drill, fill and bill, NHS. None of the technology existed. I mean, none of it. So if you talk about digital workflow, the internet didn't get turned on till 1995. So forget digital workflow. But I think also from a business perspective, back in the mid 90s, you could actually make a living out of the delivery of NHS dentistry by just turning up. And it was still profitable to be able to do that, even though people were starting to leave and move into private practice. The number of those was fairly few and far between. And I think from my perspective, the biggest difference also is to look at marketing, because when I arrived, marketing was a brass plaque on the front door and a standard size box in Yellow Pages. And then
Yellow Pages, that was it.
And then a trifold information leaflet with a picture of the practice on the front and the opening hours on the back and a few details in the middle. That was marketing. And anything beyond that, to a large extent, was prohibited by the GDC. When I turned up, there was no such thing as a dental website. When I turned up, digital workflow didn't exist. When I turned up, most of the higher value treatment that now is sold wasn't even available. It wasn't on the shelf to sell. It was a very different It was a very different shop with very few shelves, with very little products and services on the shelves. So, can you see why I'm saying that there's been such a quantum leap in trying to compare? You can't even really compare those two industries because they're so different.
Oh, they're worlds apart. And what were the people like involved in dentistry? What were the demographics and the profile of people owning and running and working in dental practices back then like?
Well, I'm going to say this, the unsayable, and say that it was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle class. End of. And so what happened was that you went off to university and you got yourself a dental degree, probably because you didn't feel that you were quite up to a full medical degree, but mummy and daddy wanted you to get a degree. And the amazing thing was back in the 90s was that you did come back, and of course you serve your time as a vocational trainee. Then
the old VT.
And then you served your time as a dental associate on 50%, because that's what everybody got paid in the UK and Ireland, unlike the rest of the world. And you went and did 1 or 2 postgraduate courses, but what would you do? You get your Endo Scout badge, and you'd get your Perio Scout badge, and that'd be about it. And then you may or may not at some stage in the future have the opportunity to either buy a practice at 1 time's earnings. Because let's go back to 1996, 97. The very first client that I had who sold his practice sold it in 1997 to a fella called David Hudley, who had set up a company called Integrated Dentology. Can I tell you, it was David Hudley's practice number 12, and he paid 35% of gross. Because you guys will remember that back in the mid to late 90s, 35% of gross was the going rate for the goodwill of the dental practice.
I think for some of the younger people listening to this, David Hudley set up IDH, Integrated Dental Holdings, which today exists and is known as My Dentist. So he was an absolute pioneer back in the day doing what he did.
It's always one of Andy and ours. We always laugh about it, and we say if we'd have been truly smart people when we bought Frank Taylor's in 2000, we'd have bought every dental practice that came across our books and put it into this limited company, and then we'd have sold it. But we weren't that smart.
True enough. And you know, how many of us missed that boat, me included?
Yeah.
Because you know you just didn't even think that way, did you? And the kind of multiples we're seeing now. But by the way, you know, for the younger people that are listening to the podcast, when I talk about a practice being sold at 35% of gross, we're all talking about multiples of EBITDA now. You know, 6.5, 7.5, or 8.5 times EBITDA. In equivalent terms, 35% of gross for most practices would probably been about 1.5 times EBITDA, something like that.
Yeah,
that's right.
1 to 1.
But it's a different world.
Very different.
But I think back to Frank Taylor and Sandra Rhodes started Frank Taylor Associates in 1988, and prior to that, there wasn't an open market for the purchase and sale of dental practices. It just didn't exist. It was a pint in a pub with somebody you knew, and you agreed a deal, and you took over. That was it. So you know, listening to your description of how dentistry, I can absolutely agree 100%, because from our side of things in the world that we live in, it's unrecognisable.
Yeah. Well, not with, you know, CQC contracts, da 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 da. You know, the days of I'm going to buy that practice in 2 weeks or whatever it might be, are definitely gone because of everything else that's there. And it's just an interesting, as you say, an evolution from dental clinical, but dental business as well, and lawyers. And anyway, let's not talk about lawyers.
There's an interesting point that you make there, Chris, though, that the thing that I've forgotten to mention in my comparison between then and now is that, to all intents and purposes, there was no CQC. The idea of somebody coming along and inspecting your practice on a regular basis didn't exist. And also, that, you know, there was a thing called the General Dental Council there that was largely a rubber stamping regulator with no teeth, and had not, and was still years away from turning into this kind of McCarthyite witch hunt that has been created over the last 15, 20 years or so. So you were relatively free. Sorry, Chris, you were relatively free from regulation. You were definitely free from litigation. And, you know, the idea that there was going to be any kind of big brother that was standing over you, trying to, quote, protect the patient, close quote, was unheard of.
I remember when CQC came in and we did some courses with, I think it was Kevin Lewis, wasn't it? Yeah. And he was great. And he said to people, this is just stuff you should have been doing anyway, he said, to protect your patients. And it's sort of this great thing of really, it seemed, why did it take so long for someone to think, hang on a minute, that someone's with sharp, spinny implements drilling into people's gums and jaws, and there's no control. Like, do you remember in the early days, when CQC first came in, there were some practices that we came across who weren't registered. They hadn't registered, and we said to him, "You've got to register." And I can remember one guy, and excuse my northern accent because he was northern, and he said to me, "Oh, this CQC, it's just not for me, Chris." And I said, "It doesn't really matter if it's not for you. You have to do it." He said, "But I don't want to do it." I said, "It doesn't matter. You've got to do it." It was almost like this thing. "Oh, I'm above CQC." What do you mean someone's going to look at what I do? But it's fascinating.
I also
it's just the new world.
I also want to pay tribute in some respect to all of those long-suffering practice managers out there, because I think it's also interesting to contrast the role of the practice manager circa 1995 compared to what it's like today. And, I'm certainly who's been on record that saying back in 1995, basically the practice manager was the mother superior. She was the ward matron in the practice, looking after the girls, looking after the rota, and looking after the supplies, and probably looking after the dentist to a certain extent as well. Whereas the modern day practice manager, I believe it's almost like an MBA equivalent qualification to be able to handle finance, marketing, customer service, compliance, clinical governance, leadership, management. Just look at the scope of practice of that role and look at how it's evolved over the years. I can see a few practice managers listening to this and saying, yes, and the bloody pay hasn't kept up with it either, has it? But that's don't shoot the messenger. But what a change. And hasn't the business of dentistry grown up over those 25 years into something that is really awesome when you see it done well?
Yeah.
Oh, and I think the competitive environment has helped, and I think good competition is always healthy, and I think you've seen more practices, more techniques, people looking for angles and ideas, and it's propelled dentistry forward. Some of the stuff that happens on the business side of dentistry now is awesome. Some of the tools and techniques. I think we saw, particularly through COVID, a real explosion of innovation, of people looking to do new and different things.
I mean, it's interesting though, and I suppose, Chris, people come to you because they recognise they don't understand what they're doing or want to achieve better. And we see lots of practices that our guys value. And it still amazes me, even though how the business of dentistry involved, the vast majority really haven't got much of an idea as to how they actually managed to make that money. They just know that they've made some money. Because we always say, whenever one of our valuers talks to someone, the first engagement is, can you tell us about your practice? Yeah, they can tell us how many surgeries, type of fee income, if it's NHS, my UDA rate, how big my contract, my lease terms, how many associates, what I pay them, my hygienist, my staff. And then you say, well, what's your profit? Oh, I don't know. and it's still prevalent today. Yeah. The vast majority of people say, I don't really know what my profit is. Well, have you got a rough idea? No. That's the thing the accountant does. And it's like...
True enough. I have to say... I'll share with you a little story that's actually hot off the press, and that is that going back to the cycling accident, I am just now beginning to get back out on the road, just few and far between. But I'm doing a few workshops, a few practice visits, and last week I did a return visit to some clients who worked with me back in 2017. And they wanted me to go back and do a review. Man and wife dental team. And we spent a lovely day up in central Scotland talking about how they've come since 2017 and what it is that they need to do next. And I said at the end of the day, something that I do say all the time now, which is that if you've had a good experience, I'd really appreciate a Google review, because I, like everybody else, consider it really important to collect those Google reviews. And God bless the lady, literally within 24 hours, she'd typed up a Google review and sent it. And of course, I got a notification. So as you always do, of course, you want to go and read what has been written. And there I am. It was actually last Saturday morning, I was reading this and thinking, I wonder if she's written about me, And I'll give you one sentence from the Google review that said, meeting with Chris is a bit like having a dad that knows all about dentistry.
Brilliant.
Now, I have to say, I'm a little bit on the fence about how I've reacted to that, because
the dad
bit, because clearly, although I did a few weeks ago celebrate my 69th birthday. I do actually think I'm still 18 in my head. which is probably why I still carry on and go out and do all this crazy stuff. So to be described by one of your clients as their pseudo dad was a little bit sobering. But at the same time, and on the flip side, I thought, wasn't that a nice thing to say? And I'm going to take it as an indication that the Chris Barrow of the 90s and the early 2000s, who might have been a bit of a Luke Skywalker and might have put a few people's noses out with some of the things he said and some of the things he did, slowly I am clearly metamorphosizing into either Obi-Wan Kenobi or Yoda.
At least it's not Darth.
True enough, and I'll leave it to the audience to decide which of those it is. But we have a little kind of, me and my team, we have a little phrase that we use with each other, which is that when people reach out to me for the first time, and I'm blessed that people do, nobody ever contacts me because they're happy. And so when somebody reaches out to me, one of the first questions I've got to answer in my own mind is, what is it that has motivated this person to send the email, fill in the online form on the website, whatever methodology that they've used, or they've been chatting to somebody at a conference, at a postgrad course, and said, I'm really worried about that. And somebody said, why don't you give Chris Barrow a call, because he might be able to help you with that. So one of the things that I'm constantly kind of subconsciously surveying is, well, why are people connecting with me? What's the distress that's leading them to reach out? And broadly speaking, and this is a bit of a sweeping generalization, but broadly speaking, it's one of three things. Chronologically, I'm still being contacted by people who are either buying the first practice or they are about to open their first practice. And I'm still dealing with private squats, even in this marketplace of ours. And I'm also dealing with first-time buyers. And I think that the interesting thing is that although you might not have had any business training at dental school, the fact is that, when you sign up for that loan and when somebody throws the keys at you and says, right, it's yours, there must be a moment. There must be a moment where they think, holy crap, what have I done? And maybe it's at that moment in time that they think, well, maybe I do need an Obi-Wan Kenobi here. Maybe I do need somebody who has been around the block a bit. And, some people might find that in a mentor. Some people might find that in a real parent. Some people might find it in a family member or a friend who's got that business experience. But some of those people reach out to me and say, okay, I need somebody along for this ride who's been this journey before and who can perhaps help me to avoid some of the more common mistakes and also perhaps accelerate the progress. That's group one, the starters. Group two are the people that have got existing businesses, and it might be one location or it might be a small number of locations, a little mini corporate or micro corporate, but they've plateaued. And what they've done is they've hit what Dan Sullivan at Strategic Coaching Toronto calls a ceiling of complexity. And a bit like a jam jar and a fly in the jam jar, they're bouncing on the lid. Yeah. And no matter what it is that they do, they can't seem to really get through to the next level. The ideas that they've got have taken them so far, but they've plateaued for a year or two. And then they reach out to me and they say, well, I'm a bit stuck and I need some growth ideas. How do I either make my existing location more profitable? How do I make my locations more profitable? Or how do I put myself in a position where I can maybe expand as well? And then the third group, which I have to say, it rather paradoxically has blossomed in recent years, are the people who are looking for an exit route. And they've realized that they are going to want to sell their practice, even though they may or may not step down from clinical delivery. They've realized that they are going to want to actually take the chips to the bank, exchange them for cash and walk out of the casino. And they recognize that that is now a much more competitive market than it ever was before, that there are more buyers, that there are more sellers, that there's a lot more that you need to understand about how goodwill valuations are calculated, and that in actual fact, what they want is somebody that's going to help them, as I say, to polish the silver before they actually put the silver up for sale. And I have to say that that's been a very, very busy part of my business over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly. I genuinely believe that every single human being is suffering from PTSD, which has been created by the last 2.5 years, whether it's been COVID, whether it's been the economy, whether it's been politics, whether it's been the geopolitical situation. We're all a bit stressed. We've had 2.5 very, very disruptive years. And a lot of people in ownership are actually burned out by that. And, you know, if they've had it with HR and team, they've had it with patients and litigation, they've had it with self-employed clinicians, they've had it with the wider marketplace, they've had it with the competition that you were talking about earlier on, Chris, and they've just had enough and they want out. And rather, with respect, than just ring Frank Taylor Associates and say, can I just put the bloody thing up for sale? Or rather than making the mistake of ringing one of the corporates direct and saying, can you come and have a look at the practice and tell me what you'd pay for it? Because that is frankly, Gary Chapman will shoot me when he hears me say this, but, you know, going direct to the corporate is a pretty bloody stupid thing to do. You do need independent advice even at the point of sale. But what I've found myself drawn into is a conversation which says, well, we're probably going to ring Frank Taylor's in a year or two, but before we get there, we'd like you to show us how to maximise both the profitability and the structure of the business so that we've got a very, very good proposition to sell. Boy, oh boy, is that keeping me busy.
Now, to be honest, Chris, all you said, we back up and support you.
And say, get a run-up.
Honestly, the amount of people who come to us and they want a valuation and then want to immediately sell their business, and quite often it's heartbreaking because you think if you'd have come to us a year or two before, there were so many things you could do with your business in that run-up to make sure that it's one, more valuable and two, more saleable. And I don't mean just, you know, screwing, you know, more dentistry out of the existing patient base to increase the fees to sell it for more. On a sustainable basis, you can improve that business so the person that takes it on ends up with a better business. So the work you're doing is good news for everybody. It means that the person selling will get a better end result, but also the person who takes the practice on will inherit a practice which has a better outcome for them in the long run.
I think people forget that processes and policies and structures actually enhance value. You know, it's about repeatability. It's about saying to someone, look, this is what we've set in place. This is what it will deliver. And that takes away uncertainty, which means value's improved. But trying to get that message across is tricky because we want, when we sell, we want a happy seller and we want a happy buyer because we want the buyer to be positive about us. And 30 years time when they come to sell it, I'll be dead, but Frank Taylor's will still be here.
But also, we've all joined up. But it's an ecosystem, isn't it? We are all joined up. Yeah, whether they're the dentists, the labs, the suppliers, the coaches, the brokers, whoever. If we don't all support dentistry end to end, it will fracture, which isn't good for any of us. So I think that whole concept of supporting the seller as well as the buyer is just good for the future of the profession.
Definitely.
And picking up on something you said, when we're talking about polishing the silver, we're not trying to just squeeze the last pip of profit out of the business. What we're actually trying to do here is to create a business that is so well run that number one, it's attractive to the buyer. First of all, because of its profitability, but also because of the ease of transition once the acquisition has been made. One of the things that I treasure is an email from Portman, which actually says in black and white, we love buying practices that are barrowed up. And the reason that we love buying practices that are barrowed up is because, number one, there's less due diligence for us to do. And number two, once we've got the practice, we also know that we've got less tinkering to do with it because it's already well run, and it's already generating good profits. So it really is a win-win-win. It's a win for the former owner. It's a win for the buyer, but it's also a win for the team and the patients as well, who continue to get good levels of service and a great place to work.
Definitely.
The things you said, Chris, give us an insight to what success looks like for your clients. What does success look like for you? What does it mean to you?
Peace of mind is number one on my list. I mentioned earlier that I celebrated a birthday recently, and I'm going to hit the big 70 next year. And both my wife and I've got 5 adult children who are all in successful jobs, successful partnerships. I've got a couple of grandchildren in there as well, and the family have been throwing at me, number one, what do you want to do for your 70th? Because it appears to be a milestone. And the second question is, what
it is
do you
but
want?
a number, sir.
It is but. And what they've also been saying to me is, well, what do you want for your 70th? Because it's a big birthday, and maybe we'd do something special. And I have to say that, try as I might, I'm struggling to think of anything. And all right, I'll go back to what I said earlier. 52 years in business, 69 years of age. I'm going to sound really, really boring, and I apologise in advance to say that I've done that part of my life where I need a flash car, and I now drive a second-hand mini roadster drop top that costs a John Cooper Works mini roadster drop top.
See, John Cooper Works there, Chris.
It cost me 12.5 grand cash, and it owes me nothing, and I absolutely love it. And I've got through the stage where I don't need a flash car, I don't need flash clothes. I'm in jeans and trainers and tops all my life. Suits now is weddings and funerals. I'm in a situation where I live in a lovely home. We've got everything we need around us in the home. I've been taking 12 weeks vacation every year since 1996, and I continue so to do. One of the things that I'm actually doing for my birthday is that for the first time, I'm dropping from a 5-day week to a 4-day week. And I'm doing that next year as a birthday present. And the reason for that is because I want to ride my bike a bit more before I die. And so Monday's going to be a bike riding day. Ironic given the recent circumstances, but that was the overall plan.
You can get yourself one of those trikes.
Oh my! Or a mobility scooter, one of the two.
I was just thinking, safety. Safety comes first.
Thank you very much. So to go back to your question, what does success mean to me? Success means to me that I've got 2 healthy, happy granddaughters, and one hopes more on the way. Success to me means I've got 5 children who are all in successful relationships, and they've all got relatively successful careers. Some of them earn more than others. They all got very, very different jobs from each other, but by and large, they're all doing okay. Success for me means that I could not be any happier with my marriage and with the relationship that I've got with Annie. Success to me means that, interestingly, 99.9% of my friends are in dentistry. We had a street party for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and my wife had to introduce me to my neighbours because I didn't really know who they were, because my friends are in dentistry. Some of my best friends are in dentistry, and when if we went away socially for a weekend to stay with another couple, there are 2 or 3 couples that we do that with, and they're all in dentistry.
Wow! Are you still friends with Steve?
Steve.
That was it. Steve Hyam, the bloke at the beginning. Was
Steve Hyam. I've not seen Steve Hyam for 30 years. I don't know.
Wow. Okay, right.
I don't know what's become of him. All right. So not only has dentistry provided me with a bloody good living in return for working hard at it, but also dentistry has provided me with a community of friends, some of whom have become very, very close and best friends, one of whom became the best man at my wedding. And I just love it. I love the community. I love who they are. Like every other community, it's got some people that you don't want to spend a lot of time with. But by and large, it's been fantastic. So what is success for me? Success is the happiness that all of that brings.
Yeah.
I hope that's
where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's lovely. I think it does. It puts you where you are now, as opposed to looking in the past or craving something in the future. It sounds like you're very content. Just to dip back into the past for 2 seconds. It was talked about a lot at the time, but you haven't talked about it for a while, so some people may not be aware. But back in 2014, there was a fairly innovative reality TV program called The Island with Bear Grylls, which you appeared on. And for people that don't know, basically Chris and a bunch of other people got put onto a castaway island and had to fend for yourself, didn't you? For what was it, a week or 10 days or whatever it was?
It was 28 days.
That was an extraordinary event. 28
days.
Wow!
Yeah.
So tell us, what was that like as an experience?
I was kind of fingers crossed we could get through that without this coming up, because you can imagine that anybody who knows me, particularly my children, whenever this subject comes up, they go, "Oh my God, Dad, not that again."
They groan, do they?
So if there is anybody out there that is left,
they can tune out now.
They can, yeah. The next 2 minutes you don't need to listen. But yes, I was one of the castaways on episode 1, series 1 of The Island with Bear Grylls. So we were really the innovators, and yes, we spent the month of February, which is why it was 28 days. On a subtropical island in the Pacific Ocean. For those who always ask, there were no cheats. We didn't have any food. We didn't have any drinks. We weren't given any firelighting equipment. We were given very little in terms of survival kit. And 13 British men were dumped into a mangrove swamp on the 1st of February. We were left there for a month to fend for ourselves. And what do you need to know? You need to know that I went on at 11 stone 10 and I came off at 10 stone. You need to know that the 13 of us lost 20 stone between us in the first 10 days. And that's because we were surviving for the first couple of weeks on about 250 calories a day, which was largely snails and coconuts. After 2 weeks, we learned how to fish, and we were able to supplement our diet up to about 500 or 600 calories a day with some of the fish that we caught. But it was a tough call, and I learned something about leadership. I learned something about teamwork. But of course, most importantly of all, I learned something about me, and what I learned about me, and it's kind of ironic, given what happened years later with COVID. What I learned about me is that I'm resilient. That some people have called me Mr. Weevil. That no matter how you knock me down, I just bounce back up again, and all 13 of us survived that experience. And the interesting thing is that of the subsequent further series of that particular show at The Island with Bear Grylls, I think it ended up with about 9 series in the UK, and also it's been remade around the world as well. And to this day, we are the only group where everybody stayed till the end, to this day.
Wow.
And, are you still in contact with any of them, Chris?
Yes, we are. We have a WhatsApp group, and we stay in contact with each other.
Brilliant.
And we've got our 10-year anniversary coming up very soon, and there's a rumble in us having some kind of a party. I'm not quite sure. It might be in a bush shelter in Aberdeen or something, but we'll see. It was a great experience. It was a great experience, and
so to still be in still be in touch. Then it sounds like there wasn't any kind of William Golding, Lord of the Flies moments. It sounds like
quite the opposite.
You sort of all got on.
No, quite the opposite. With about a week to go, we'd split into 3 cliques, the 13 of us, and it was demographically based. All the lads under 30 stayed together. All the lads 30 to 50 stayed together. And there were 4 of us that were 50 to 70. One of the guys was 70 years old when he did it.
Interesting.
And us old wrinklies stayed together. And we weren't speaking to each other because we were all so pissed off with each other. And actually, we all had a meeting with about a week to go and said, we've got a choice to make here, which is that we either go and camp on separate parts of the island and not speak to each other, or we just bloody well get over ourselves and get on with it. And we decided on the latter. And over the last 4 or 5 days, we kind of rebuilt the bridges. But after 3 weeks, we'd broken. We'd broken. And that was another lesson that I took away. By the way, I've done a lot of...
What tribe are you in?
I've done a lot of extreme expeditions. I've done wild camping in deserts. I've done mountain climbing. I've done tropical islands. I've done quite a few of this stuff. And can I say that I've never, ever done an extreme expedition where it hasn't broken at some stage in direct proportion to the level of stress and discomfort that was existing within the group. So another thing about human nature is that when you put people together in a high stress environment, actually expect it to break, and be ready for that, and be ready with with how to put it back together again. And of course, that's become quite useful over the last few years because most dental teams have broken to some extent or other. And people come to me and go, "Oh my God, my team's broken. I'm a failure." And I'm going, no. Your team's broken because that's human nature. Now we need to fix it. Because people, particularly business owners, particularly dental practice owners and practice managers, when the team breaks, they sometimes think that it's their fault that they're lousy leaders.
They take it personally,
And I have to keep stepping in there and saying, no. You know, I wouldn't use this as a metaphor in a conversation with a client, but every expedition, including the island with Bear Grylls, we broke. And what you need to do is be ready to put it back together again.
Yeah. Chris, honestly it's fascinating. We should have a series. This doesn't cover. Doesn't even scratch the surface.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Of the
I suppose
stories
if you think 26 years, it's quite a lot going on there.
Exactly.
And that's only in dentistry.
Yeah. But no, honestly, I think your stories. I think the stuff that you do. There's a lot of crossover with what we do, and it's nice. Our paths keep crossing. You know, over those years, there's different reasons that we know we're kind of working together or supporting one another. We always finish up in the same way. We always ask our guests the same 2 questions, and the first question we like to ask is, if you could be a fly on the wall in a situation, what situation would that be, and when would it be, and who would you be with?
Yeah. Now, I'm going to say, for the sake of the audience, I was primed with this question, and so the response I'm giving you is not off the cuff. I have given this some thought, and I'm going to give you a rather unusual answer. But I would like to be a fly on the wall on the 8th of June, 1924, at the top of Mount Everest, and the reason for that is because I've had a lifelong fascination with mountain climbing and mountain climbers. And one of the great unsolved mysteries of climbing is whether or not George Mallory summited Everest in 1924 with Irving, his climbing partner. And although both of their bodies have sadly been found, there remains still no clear evidence as to whether Mallory actually became the first man to climb Everest and not Edmund Hillary in the year that I was born, 1953. And I would love, and by the way, if you ever read the story of Mallory and Irving's expedition, there are some enigmatic clues that would suggest that maybe they did make it, but the climbing community is divided about that. And I clearly wouldn't love to be stood on the top of the mountain with them.
No.
Because the overwhelming balance of probabilities is that I would have died like they did. But I'd love to be able to kind of be in a little bubble and just see whether he made it. So there's my.
That's a great one. Yeah,
that's a great one. I on that I recently listened to there's a podcast, high performance podcast, and last week they talked to Kenton Cole, the climber, and some of the stories he tells about extreme climbing. It's just ridiculous. The situations these guys find themselves in, it's off the charts. Off the charts.
I never understand the guys who do free climbing with no ropes or anything. I just think you are completely mad.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah. Yeah. And our follow-up question, Chris, is if you could meet somebody, you were given the opportunity to meet anybody you'd like to, who would you like to sit down with a glass of red wine and have a chat to?
I struggled with this one, and the reason I struggled with this one is because I've probably got 100 people on the list, and it's so difficult. I'm going to allow myself 2 answers, if that's okay.
Okay. No problem at all. We'll just edit out one of them.
And thank you. Good night.
And my first answer is kind of a generic answer, which is that I mentioned to you on that I'm an avid reader, and I could write a list of 100 novelists that I would love to sit down and talk to, but probably the top of that list is Charles Dickens, because I've remained perpetually fascinated by first of all his work rate. The rate at which he turned out the material that he turned out for his penny weeklies, because it reminds me very much of an avid blogger, which in some respects many of us are.
Yeah, interesting.
But also secondarily to talk to him about the early influences that led him to create many of the characters in the books that he wrote. And you can't see it, but over there on the bookshelf behind me are the complete works of Dickens, which occupy pride and place at the centre. So that was my first answer. But my second answer is very much more personal, and that is that my maternal grandfather sadly passed away when I was about 10 years old, and as a child he was my best friend. And there's a whole great story about that, which we don't have time for now. But I've always been fascinated about the fact that I don't really know anything about his early life in Manchester in the 1920s as a working class Methodist teetotaler who married a Roman Catholic, who was an engineer working for the railway company. But pride of place in my bedroom is one of his oil paintings, and we do also have some of the poetry that he wrote in his 20s and his 30s as well. And I never had the opportunity to talk with him as an adult. And so if I could meet Albert Meller again, possibly towards the end of his life, but if I could speak to him as the adult that I am now, and if I could say, I'd love to do a podcast interview with him, and say, could you tell me a little bit about your early life growing up in the 1920s and 30s in Manchester?
Cool. I wonder what Albert Meller from the 1920s would make of us sitting here doing a podcast. Blow his mind.
Fascinating.
Chris, it's been an absolute joy.
It's been a hoot.
We were hoping for 20 minutes. We got an hour and 10. Didn't surprise me one bit.
No.
Yeah.
So much more that we could have talked about.
Absolute pleasure. You and I go back. The two of you and I go back an awful long way. It's always been a great relationship, and here's to many, many, many more years of the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll look forward to getting you back when you hit your milestone birthday, when you can tell us all about it.
All right, thanks, guys.
Excellent. Just
Cheers, Chris. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dentology, where we discuss the business of dentistry. If you like what you heard, please do subscribe where you found this episode. That would be amazing. And also follow us on Instagram.